Ari, welcome back. Nice to see you again, and thank you for joining us this morning to give us more testimony on Vermont soils. I was saying that we heard from Heather Darby with the extension sometime last week, and wanted to just pick that conversation up again.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, glad to be here. Ari Rockman Miller with the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, Senior Agricultural Development Coordinator. And I'm going to give, if it works for the committee, kind of an overview of primary agricultural soils and talk about the Act 250 context of Criterion 9B and how mitigation and impacts are reviewed in that context. I'm also happy to touch upon the Section 248 and solar topic. I don't have slides on that, but I'm definitely glad to at least introduce that topic as well. And happy to answer any questions whenever it works for the committee. And feel free to interrupt me as I go if you have questions that arise. So yeah, if you want to just go to the next slide, please. So first I'm going to talk about the Act 250 context, and then I'll talk a little more about what primary ag soils are in just a minute. But I want to explain that under Act 250, Criterion 9B, which is titled Primary Agricultural Soils, the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets is a statutory party, meaning that when jurisdictional development proposes to impact primary ag soils, we review it, and we have party status in those proceedings. We encourage pre-application outreach and kind of working with landowners and project consultants, often engineers, sometimes attorneys, sometimes just the landowner themselves, to review the site plans and get a sense of how many acres on the tract meet the definition of primary agricultural soils, how much of the design is going to impact that land or leave it unimpacted. And we also review the sufficiency of any proposed on-site mitigation land. I'll talk more about what that is in just a minute. And recommended permit conditions subject to approval by the Land Use Review Board's district environmental commissions.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, go ahead.
Patricia, is there any way to remove or move that house agriculture that's showing up on the screen? I don't know what that is.
Might be able to just grab it.
No, it's not on my screen, unfortunately. So let's just see.
What's this?
It's irritating, isn't it?
I'm sorry to interrupt,
Yeah,
but
shall I pause the live stream while we figure it out, or just do my best with it? So we're here.
let's just take a moment and we don't need to pause the live stream.
Right. So
Have to do the monitor itself.
You can continue. Actually, Ari, why don't you go ahead and continue, and
Sounds great.
you can let us know when you need to change the slide.
Perfect. So yeah, as you know, the district commissions of the Land Use Review Board ultimately issue the permit conditions and findings, but the Agency of Agriculture is a party in those proceedings insofar as it relates specifically to primary agricultural soils. So you mentioned it before we got started about the multipliers, and so this is in statute, and there is a section of statute, Title 10, Section 6093. That lays out mitigation of primary agricultural soils. And that statute says that there'll be multipliers between 2 and 3 based on the agricultural value of the soils being impacted. And then there are certain special scenarios where a 1-to-1 ratio applies, or a multiplier of 1 in designated areas as defined. Also associated with Act 181, wood product manufacturers can now avail themselves of the 1-to-1 ratio when it meets that definition. And then also for the 1-to-1 also applies to industrial parks as defined and permitted by Act 250 and in existence as of 2006. So that part is a little bit meet the definition of a industrial park and have been around since 2006. And again, the statute right there, 10 VSA section 6093, is what lays out mitigation of primary agricultural soils.
So I interrupt again.
No problem.
And I'll just say, I've got 2 questions here, and maybe you'll be answering them and you can just say, we'll get to that. But wondering if you can tell us more about the, like, between 2 and 3 based on soil value.
Right.
So what are those exactly?
Absolutely.
And then what does it actually mean to mitigate?
Right. So next slide, please. I may have something on that. Let's see. Okay, so actually this is not, so I'll just answer your question. So the multipliers are, for NR, so I guess I'll back up a little bit. So NRCS, the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, and that's actually referenced on this slide as well in the definition of primary ag soils. They do a lot of the work as far as rating the soils, and we use their mapping, and I'll show you a slide in a minute showing some examples of that mapping to review projects. Their ratings have agricultural value groups that are between 1 and 7 typically as it relates to the good primary ag land. If it gets to be 8 or above, it could still be a valuable soil. It could still be used for agriculture, especially for sugar bushes, or often on a ag value 8+, could be slopier. But typically the prime, statewide, and local importance soils, which are referenced here, would correspond with agricultural value groups 1 being the primest of the prime, to 7 still being an excellent soil, a statewide soil, potentially has some limitations. Maybe it's a good soil, but it's got a little slope, or it's got some bedrock, or or it's a little wet. So again, ag value group 1 is the best of the best, and that's almost always going to be called prime. And then all the way up to 7 is still a great soil, but not quite as good. The multiplier of 3 is reserved for agricultural value group 1. And I'm not sure I have a slide on this, but it is on our webpage. And then it kind of just goes from there. So ag value group 2 is going to have 2.75 multiplier. Ag value group 3 is going to have 2.5. Ag value group 4 is going to be 2.25. And then ag value group 5 to 7 is a multiplier of 2. So that's how we follow the statute saying between 2 and 3. And again, there are those kind of special situations where 1 can apply. Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So your multiplier value, so you put a value of what prime ag soil is. And then if it is number 1, like we have in Derby Line or in other places, you multiply that by 3.
Yeah, so if it's
When a developer wants to develop it, they have to give 3 times the going rate.
so
To the VHCB.
that's mostly true, but let me just clarify a little bit.
Yeah.
So if you're going to, let's say hypothetical, you're impacting 2 acres of the best soils in Vermont, the ag value 1, which we have very little of as far as top tier ag value 1. So that would have the multiplier of 3. So if you're going to impact 2 acres of that, you'd have to set aside 6 acres of mitigation. That could be on-site mitigation land, which I have a slide on in a minute, which means setting aside soils, not paying a fee, but just setting aside land on your tract to be available for future and present agricultural use. So if you're already farming it, that's probably not a big deal, or if you don't want to develop it in the future. But if you have development plans for those soils in the future, you might not want to set aside that land and save it for agriculture, depending on the landowner's goals. So that's when offsite mitigation fees to VHCB might come into play. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But essentially, yes, we first look at how many acres are being impacted. That's the first question. So is it less than an acre? Is it 2 acres? And then we apply the applicable multiplier based on ag value group. And it can be a little bit of a complicated calculation because it could be, 2 acres of the best and then half an acre of the next tier. And it can get, so it becomes kind of like good.
Thank you, Chair. So the offsite mitigation fees, is that, I'm picturing in my mind something like the money, whoever the developer is pays a certain amount determined by LURD perhaps. And that would be, I'm just saying what I think it might be. And that goes into, maybe it's given to the, Vermont land trust. And then they use that money to conserve land. Is that a possibility, or how does that work?
So I have a slide on that in just a minute, but in a nutshell, when offsite mitigation fees are approved, which when you're in a designated area, it's kind of the default. When you're outside of a designated area, offsite mitigation fees are only available when a commission finds appropriate circumstances to enable mitigation flexibility, which is a common finding. It's not usually too much of a hurdle, but it can be a hurdle demonstrating you meet the test to kind of why should you pay a fee as opposed to just setting aside land right on your tract. But when you do pay that fee, it goes to the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, VHCB. And then VHCB in turn leverages those fees along with other sources of funding. There often are federal funds available that VHCB leverages, sometimes other state or local funds. So those funds actually get leveraged and maximized to go even further. And then VHCB, consistent with their kind of farmland conservation policies, uses those funds to purchase easements on primary agricultural soils in the same geographic region as the development. And so it's the easement holder in some cases, land trusts may come into play in that context as far as holding an easement, but VHCB is the entity that administers the offsite mitigation fund and determines with their board and their policies which farms to prioritize conserving. And so they're kind of the key administrator of that fund.
Representative O'Brien?
Just before we move on, I just wonder what happens to the other soils in Vermont that don't make the 1 to 7 grade, the sad soils.
Right, that's the question. And that actually ties me back to this slide right here. So, so the definition of primary agricultural soils, I know it says a lot there, but essentially, if they're rated by NRCS as being prime, statewide, or local, they're kind of presumed to meet the definition unless one of these sub-factors applies, which usually would be pre-existing development, like, there could be ag soils right under this building, but obviously they're not, ag soils anymore. So there could be pre-existing impacts. There could be the presence of a class 2 or class 1 wetland, topographic or physical barriers. But then the prong B, and this relates to your question, Representative O'Brien, prong B says soils on the project tract the commission finds to be of agricultural importance due to present or recent use for agriculture, even if those were not identified by NRCS as being important farmland. So that's kind of where the proof is in the pudding. If you've actively been farming something, regardless of the rating, if it's growing food, it's probably an ag soil. So that's kind of where even unrated soils can come into play. There could be other soils that are ag value 8 or 9 and not rated, that are not being farmed, that theoretically could be decent farmland, but if they're not either rated or in recent ag use, they probably would not fall within the definition.
So the soil skill keeps going past.
It does keep going. Yeah. So 8 plus is called, usually 8 and above is called NPSL, not prime, statewide, or locally important. And yeah, right. I mean, that's the thing. Like Vermonters are resourceful and enterprising, and in many cases we have farmed even those soils, especially for sugar bushes or for pasture. So they still could be great soils. But as far as the definition goes of kind of the PAS top tier, it's usually the rated or the ag use. And it does say recent ag use, so that could be, a little while back if it has historical importance for farming.
So like Heather Darby showed us a map, of Borderview Farm. And it looks like if we're going to develop 10 acres, you could easily have, 5 or 6 different soil types, just sort of like a topographical map in that. So it must be very complicated then for your multipliers.
The calculations do get a little bit, parentheses, like, 2 acres times ag value, 2.5 plus 1 acre times this. So it becomes a bit of like a, glad I took algebra. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Does it stop at 9? Is that the?
No, it can go all the way up to 12, I believe. I think. Yeah.
And the primary, the prime, statewide, and local, are they all within the 1 to 7?
Almost always, yeah. Yeah. And the only reason I say almost always is sometimes the local could be an ag value 8, and a region could kind of say this is an important soil in our municipality or our region. That should be a local importance. So sometimes 8 can get in there, but almost always 1 to 7. Yeah.
I think Jed, you had your hand waiting.
Thank you. Ari, I'm sorry to need clarification, but if I wanted to develop 2 acres of 1 or 2 prime,
Mhm.
and I needed to put, let's say, 2 acres, if I had 6 acres on another portion of my land, I would still have to pay a fee, even if I was willing to put a conservation easement on a portion of that land.
Great question. So I think there's a slide coming up about on-site mitigation. Patricia, would you mind just going to them? Okay, so I'll just directly answer the question because it's a couple slides down the pipeline. So if you had, good question. So if you have land on your tract and you don't want to pay a fee, you want to just set aside your own land, that may be an option. In fact, on-site mitigation is encouraged outside of designated areas. There are a few considerations there. That it's got to consist of primary ag soils as well, the set aside land. It's got to be usually as good or better than the soils being impacted. It's got to be usually on your project tract. So it couldn't be something, 50 miles away. It's got to have a jurisdictional nexus. There are a couple of examples of where soils that are not on the tract have been used for on-site mitigation, when an applicant can demonstrate that those soils are subject to the commission's jurisdiction in some form, or usually like within 5 miles and owned by the same landowner. So there are ways that soils down the road could maybe be used for on-site mitigation, but typically it's going to be soils on your tract. So you can have a lot of land and you're developing over here and you're setting aside land over here, and that's encouraged. And I have a slide in a minute that kind of shows some of the criteria we use in reviewing when someone's proposing on-site mitigation.
And that mitigation, you would still hold title to that land, but it would have a conservation easement on.
Good question. Yeah. So
You need a surveyed meets and bounds for that offsetting.
right. So in the context of on-site mitigation, yes, the landowner would still retain title. They still own the land. In the context of on-site mitigation, it wouldn't even typically be a formal easement. It would be a permit condition issued by the district commission that says, these soils shall be available for agricultural use in perpetuity. If any improvements other than agricultural structures are proposed, the permittee shall have to go through a Rule 34E analysis, which essentially balances finality of the permit condition with flexibility to change it or amend it. So there are some ways that even those soils can be released in the future, but the permittee has to make a pretty high bar of demonstrating why they should be released from that function. Usually, once they're set aside, they're for present and future ag use. So you retain title and it's protected by a permit condition of the commission. Whereas in the offsite mitigation context, the VHCB fund, they're actually purchasing conservation easements, which are different in a legal sense, but achieve a similar purpose of setting aside farmland.
So
Yeah.
hypothetically, there's no transfer. 30 years go by, you passed away, you have no way, there's a new owner. Is there somewhere in that chain of title with flags? In the deed. It's in the deed.
Yeah, so it runs with the land, and there should be, one of
That
the,
gets recorded.
I would think so. Yeah,
You have to.
and the Act 250 permit condition kind of still applies to the land. And I think in the land records, there'd be something to give a flag about that. Yeah.
Thank you.
We've got more questions here. Representative Bartholomew.
Just to make sure I understand, you said 14 different levels?
I said 12. It might be 11. I feel like in my daily work, because typically I'm thinking about ag value 1 to 7.
1 to 7 is the prime.
1 to 7 is, typically prime, statewide, or local. Primary,
What
yeah.
does 11 or 12 look like? Is it like bedrock or?
Right. It could be very steep. It could be, but even there was grazed at one point historically. So it's like, any soil theoretically could be farmed, but some are much easier to farm than others. Some are much harder. I feel like in my daily work, ag value 11 is the highest value I usually see. I have to double check now, is 12 one of them or not? But certainly 8 to 11 is something I see often. That's called NPSL, not prime, statewide, or local. And again, some they're like really thriving sugar bushes and hill farms that do use those soils for agriculture, which is excellent too, but it just takes a little more resourcefulness.
So there's endless questioning on this. So then whatever it is, 11 or 12, does every square foot of dry land in Vermont have a value, or is there some land like a quarry that has no value? It's not, it doesn't have a rating even. Yeah.
Right. Good question. So almost all of the land in Vermont would have a rating. It might not be a good rating, but it would have a rating. And then two things. There are a couple of spots that are not rated, which would typically be maybe like military base, or I'm trying to think of what it would be, kind of unusual context where they just haven't rated it, or they've done no investigations of the soils there. But the vast majority of the state is rated in some form. But the rating might be, not prime statewide or local, might be ag value 11. But usually there's some NRCS classification as it relates to the soils. But again, in many cases, there could be existing impacts. So it could be a quarry, maybe it's ag value 7, but might have lost its agricultural potential due to prior work. Yeah.
Even Bear Rock would be rated.
It might have a bad rating, but it would typically have some sort of a.
How can it be soil if there's no soil?
Right, yeah.
Lichen can grow with.
Yeah, lichens. Most of us don't eat lichens.
We're not the only part of the food. John sheep eat
We don't
lichen.
have a lot of reindeer here, though.
There you go, sheep. Yeah.
I think Richard was next.
No, I'm good. So there's a tract of land in Derby that needs to have housing on it. We don't own it, okay? So it's not about me.
You know.
It is top level. It has been fallow now for 10 years.
Hmm.
It has I'm sure it is prime ag #1, deep soils. It should be in our tier 1B in town. And it's 14 acres, and the cost to take that out to put housing on it is $140,000. $10,000 an acre for mitigation, so 3 to 1. I can tell you that if VHCB Land Trust comes to buy your development rights on your prime ag soil, we just sold a large tract to them for about $2,500 an acre. So I'm wondering who gets to keep all the extra money is where my mind's going.
So are you talking about the sale price was?
No, the fee to develop that prime ag, that's not even selling the lots. The fee is $140,000 on that 14 acres.
Using this kind of calculation.
Using the calculation and I get it because we're selling development rights and we want to get the biggest bang for our buck. And we haven't sold development rights in Derby yet. These were in Albany. Which doesn't have the same developmental pressures as Derby. I'm just trying to wrap my head around the whole thing is how do we have housing when you have that kind of penalty? But then again, we need to preserve our prime ag land, but the best place for housing is our prime ag soils.
So yeah, excellent illustration of the competing
Yeah.
interests, and the math sounds a little strange. Can we keep going?
Yes.
Just because I know that, I'm not sure how long we have already, but.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say that's an interesting question. I would need to understand, the specific context a little better. There are rates per acre based on each district. I'll talk about that more in a minute, like costs per acre that are based on, the cost per acre should be based on the VHCB, or it is based on the VHCB closings data in that region. So there's a calculation looking at the closings and the per acre costs and how a cost per acre is developed. The one consideration I was going to add, because you mentioned different tiers, is that just to clarify, everything I'm talking about with criterion 9B mitigation is in the context of jurisdictional land under Act 250. So if there's a tract that is exempt from Act 250 for whatever reason, an interim exemption, or it just the landowner did not trigger Act 250 jurisdiction, then none of this would come into play. So this is specifically for jurisdictional projects. So it's good to keep that in mind too.
So if you're putting up a single home on 2 acres, say, it's not going to trigger Act 250 because, I mean, if there is a 5-year and 5-mile kind of a thing, then maybe yes, but.
Right, it's a little complicated because there could be like prior jurisdiction from a previous, but yeah, for non-jurisdictional projects, there's no criterion 9B because it is one of the Act 250 criteria.
Yeah.
So if tier 1A, Act 181. Tier 1A, 1B, soils, lands won't have Act 250 jurisdiction. Does that mean that this criteria 9B goes away and they don't have to pay those? And you know, the devil's in the details, so. You know, are we gonna lose our ability to preserve? I'm really conflicted with this issue.
Yeah.
You know, I'm looking at it from, you know, we need housing, but we need to protect our prime ag soil, so I'm really conflicted. But if we, you know, Rutland creates all that 1B and, you know, there are some prime ag soils in there, is that gonna come out of 9B criterion, and they're not gonna have to give money to the VHCB to preserve prime ag land elsewhere?
So, yeah, so I could say, first of all, that the agency shares your feelings that it's extremely important to maintain the agricultural potential of our farmland in Vermont. At the same time, housing is also very important. So it is a tension in this work that we're always trying to navigate and find the right balance. For questions about what would be jurisdictional under different tiers, I think the Land Use Review Board would be the best one to speak to that. What I can say is that for anything that's not jurisdictional, criteria 9B does not apply. So because it only applies to jurisdictional projects. So there are pros and cons to, you know, it is a push and pull as to jurisdictional projects have to mitigate, which is a good thing as far as conserving the agricultural potential. At the same time, you know, housing is also really important. So it's complex.
I think that, you know, if anybody from LURB or anyone else is eavesdropping and wants to correct me, they can and will. But I think the answer is, yeah, under the proposal, if you're in tier 1B, it's for housing anyway, you would not have to, you wouldn't have to set aside the 3-to-1 or pay into the fund, yeah.
I think there should be a tie-in to the density of housing on that land to stop someone from building a ski shack.
So let's go, a couple other, Greg, did you have a hand up before? John?
Yeah, I was just wondering if the whole 9B was created to make the filter agricultural. So if you took Victory Bog, you know, isn't good farming land, but it's important as far as habitat goes.
Right.
Water, you know,
Mhm.
sink of some sort.
Yeah.
And so are there other sort of either mitigations or classifications for important lands that aren't agricultural?
Sure. So there's a different criteria or criterion of Act 250 called 9C, which is for productive forest soils. That's not something that the Agency of Agriculture reviews, but it is a criterion that, you know, Forest Parks and Rec could probably speak to. There also is a criterion about wetlands. So in the case of a really significant wetland, ANR would certainly review under that criterion. I think it's 1G, I want to say. So not in the context of ag soils, but other criteria hopefully address those valid considerations. I love bogs too. So, yeah.
And they have mitigation, or some of them are just totally off limits?
I guess you'd probably want to speak with ANR about that.
Yeah, interesting.
Unless you are the landfill for the state, and then they can mitigate anything.
Just speaking of the landfill, state chairman, the category of land called brownfield, which may have had functional improvements, but and it's not a proud designation, it's a challenge, but Vermont is very, the US generally invested in mitigating the toxicity, convert brownfields to functional land. It's clearly not IMAG that are there many brownfields that are privately owned or individually owned? And what's the potential for them?
Right. Yeah, I'm not an expert on brownfields, but I would imagine that many could be privately owned. I know there have been some reviews where 9B reviews where an applicant says, hey, I know the soils here are mapped as being primary ag, But if you look at this other map, it shows a brownfield site, a hazardous waste site, that could be a factor in the review when an applicant's trying to demonstrate soils might have lost their agricultural potential. It also could be that a tract of land has some excellent soil and then some others that are contaminated. So it's kind of site-specific analysis. It's a good question. Yeah, I mentioned that before we got started that I was here a couple of years ago giving testimony on the state mushroom, and just as a fun story, I in my free time when I used to live in Burlington, found a ton of morels, a really special mushroom along kind of the waterfront in Burlington, and then I saw a sign that says "Caution: Arsenic in Soil." So I did not eat those morels. So
You could have had one a year.
okay, yeah.
They went into baby
It would have
food
killed
fields.
the heartworm that was in you.
Yeah, you never know.
Yeah, and just thinking back, and I don't want to let you keep going, Harry, but thinking back to the 14 acres or even, an arbitrary, like say 6 acres, that number. If you've got enough land, if you've got 6 acres and you want to develop 1 acre and you're subject to jurisdiction, as long as you've got 3 other acres that you can set aside that are good, soil wise, then that's the preferred approach. That it sounds like that's what everybody would prefer to do rather than have you pay in.
So that's the default approach on-site mitigation when you're outside of designated area as defined in the statute. Within the designated areas that are listed in the statute, it's kind of the opposite, that offsite mitigation fees are the default. But either way, someone could propose the other one, depending on their preferences, but it would just require a finding of appropriate circumstances by a commission.
Okay.
So it somewhat depends on where you are. And as far as like landowners go, some would prefer on-site mitigation because it doesn't cost any money and you might just feel good about setting aside land for agriculture on your attractive land. It's could align with your values and your goals to farm the soil. Other folks prefer an offsite mitigation fee because maybe the land has a very high development value, and some developers would just, in my experience, would prefer to pay a fee to restricting the use of their land in the future. So it really depends on the context.
All right. We'll see if we can, I will try and be more disciplined about my own questions, and we'll let you continue here.
Well, the good news is we've covered a lot of the slides already. So good questions. You're asking the right things.
All right.
So actually, so this one here, I'm sorry, can you just go back one slide? So this one here is just a screenshot of the ANR Atlas. And this is, if you're curious, even just, for fun, you can use one of 2 tools I'd recommend. There might be a third as well, but I usually use either the ANR Atlas, which this is a screenshot of here. And there's a layer in that called geology. And under the geology layer, there's a soils primary agricultural tab. And that's one way to see kind of what soils are rated as being prime, statewide, or locally important. It wouldn't necessarily always mean they meet the definition because there could be, this is a good example. This, I believe, is South Burlington area. So almost all of that is rated as being excellent farmland. Some of it retains its potential. Other parts are clearly already developed or fragmented. So it's a good starting point, but it might not, the mapping doesn't tell you if there's an existing impact or not. And if you go to the next slide, please. This one is the same tool, ANR Atlas, and the same South Burlington, Shelburne region, and showing you the soil ratings I was talking about. So pink being statewide, green is the prime, the top tier, and then purple is a statewide B, so still a good soil, but maybe a little wetter. I think the bluish color is a statewide A, like a good soil with a slope limitation. But essentially, all those colors are showing you the layer in the ANR Atlas for geology. And this is an example of a spot where there's been a lot of loss of farmland, but also a lot of important housing projects. So it's a push and pull. And the good news from the ag perspective, and you can look at this image and have different interpretations, but the good news is that not all, but much of that has mitigated either on-site or through an off-site mitigation fee to VHCB. Again, it only applies to jurisdictional land, but many of those impacts were mitigated, but at least the jurisdictional ones. So, yeah, so that's just an example of an area where you could have a lot of good soils, but there also could be existing impacts or fragmentation to them. And this is a screenshot of the NRCS Web Soil Survey. I think the ANR Atlas on the prior slide is very user-friendly. I think NRCS Web Soil Survey, however, it has the most up-to-date, technically current data, because NRCS, after all, is the one providing this data. So this is a really good tool to use just to double check everything is up to date. And it's a little more complicated, but you got to go into the land classifications tab on the left, and then go to soil reports. And then there's a agricultural value group Vermont. And this will tell you the specific ag value group. The ANR Atlas on the prior slide will tell you prime or statewide or local, but this will tell you the actual number, whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 for agricultural value group. So it's a good way to determine that. And that looks like essentially where we are right now in Montpelier, I believe. So
we can zoom in and see what the backyard is.
yeah, I mean, and this one doesn't color it, so it doesn't pop up with colors, but it does. You can define an area of interest with kind of one of that area AOI tool on the top left, kind of draw a polygon around a certain area, and then go to soil reports, land classifications, ag value groups Vermont, and it'll tell you, what the ag value is, whether it's the top tier of ag value 1 or a statewide soil of ag value 7 or NPSL like ag value 11, not prime.
Representative Bryan?
All right, I wondered if anybody had ever done a study, whether, at the agency or extension, of, taking 100 or 200 acres like Taft Corners and said, this development, resulted from mitigation in easements, here. I mean, it'd be just fascinating to look like what we gave up with development.
Right.
We conserved, here.
Right.
You could sort of see the one-to-one or the multipliers going on, like you're talking about.
Right.
It'd be really interesting.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. Yeah, I mean, we have some reports on our website that kind of talk about impacts and mitigation and the ratios. But as far as like the project to project analysis, it's an interesting way to look at it. It's a good suggestion. Yeah.
And when that development wasn't, like Taft Corner wasn't thought of all at once. So that sort of on-site mitigation, didn't happen with the thought that the next lot over then, might be completely developed.
Sure.
Were those mitigation rules in place when Taft Corners first was
I
developed?
think so, yeah. Most of it. And it has to be prime ag soil too.
Act 70 was, or Act 250 was around 1970.
Right.
Was time.
Yeah.
Right. And then the framework for, I don't know the exact date, but the framework for offsite mitigation fees came a little later. But yeah, Act 250 has been around for more than 50 years now. Yeah.
Right, but there wasn't in the original 10 criteria. I don't recall that there was a offset mitigation.
Did that come later then?
It came a little later, and there used to be, I know there used to be a significantly reduced test. So there was a time, I can't remember what year, but for a while where someone could essentially impact up to a third of the soils and say, okay, because I've impacted less than a third, I have not significantly reduced the agricultural potential of the soil. So there were still, design parameters, so you don't impact everything, but it used to be a little less rigorous as far as actual mitigation taking place. And then I can't remember the year off the top of my head, but at some point that language of significantly reduced got removed. And now it says criteria 9B itself now says you have to mitigate for any reduction in agricultural potential. So it got tightened up a little bit. And then the framework for on-site and off-site mitigation also developed over time. Off-site mitigation came later.
Why don't we keep going? We only got about 15 minutes. And I want to make sure, or that we give you a chance also to mention 248.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's it.
Right, great. Okay, so I've covered much of this, but just a slide that kind of summarizes the framework for off-site mitigation fees to VHCB. So essentially, it's a fee paid by the permittee into the Vermont Housing Conservation Board Trust Fund for the purpose of conserving soils in the region. It's the default outside of designated areas. And then, excuse me, it's the default in designated areas. I misspoke. It is available only when there's a finding of appropriate circumstances outside of designated areas. And it's based on a price per acre fee based on closings in the region. And VHCB leverages those funds, like I said, to purchase conservation easements. Then on-site mitigation, we've also talked about, but the agency reviews site plans. And so there'd be a drawing that the applicant provides showing where they want to develop, and then also showing what they want to set aside for present and future agricultural use by permit condition. And we do review that with some rigor to make sure we're not getting, mediocre land or land that's not available for ag. So it's got to be equal or better usually to the soils being impacted. The statute for on-site mitigation says it has to be capable of supporting or contributing to an economic or commercial agricultural operation. So it doesn't need to be actively farmed today, but it's got to be available for agriculture and capable of actually supporting a farming operation. The bar for on-site mitigation is actually even a little higher in statute than the bar for the definition of a primary ag soil. They actually are in different sections of statute. The definition of PAS, primary ag, used to say the commercial agricultural part, and that was amended by the legislature in 2014. The definition became a little broader, just saying, I showed you before, prime statewide local rating, unless there's other factors that have reduced the ag potential. So on-site mitigation still has this requirement of being capable, at least in theory, of supporting an economically viable operation, whereas the definition no longer has that word. And this is a report on our website that kind of looked at, we had an intern, Randy Roy, help us a lot with this, looking at surveying landowners with on-site mitigation soils and looking at how much of it's actually being farmed today and what kind of barriers are there. So if you go to the next slide, it built off this 2015 pilot project that also surveyed landowners. And this is just a screenshot from a different report that was kind of looked at impacts and mitigation, also available on our website. I would just note, as far as the on-site mitigation survey goes, we had a lower response rate than we hoped. I know it's kind of typical with surveys. It's hard to get people to chime in. We got some interesting responses, but I think that there always are more opportunities to align farmers with on-site mitigation land, more opportunities to really have it in thriving ag use. So it's a great resource as far as soils that are set aside to retain their agricultural potential. At the same time, we can't force a farmer to farm it at all times. So we were surveying people to see how can we really try to align those who want to be farming with on-site mitigation land on a project tract. As I mentioned, the on-site mitigation land is still going to be owned by the landowner. So there would still need to be permission or a lease for if someone else wants to farm it. So there's kind of a property rights consideration there too, that it's owned by the landowner, but it's got to at least be available for agriculture. So there can't be restrictions that make it unfarmable. And this is another screenshot from these reports. So showing essentially that, impacts and then on and off-site mitigation, which the mitigation should be greater because of the multipliers typically. Slide, please. Okay, let's see. Is that the last? Oh, that's the last slide. So yeah, let me touch upon section 248 and solar for a moment. So I'm newer to that side of the work, but it's also very important. So in the context of solar development, there are certain threshold criteria under section 248 as to how many megawatts or what triggers a section 248 proceeding review. The agency also has a role in reviewing those impacts under section 248, which is an entirely distinct regulatory permitting framework from Act 250. In the section 248 context, at least in theory, the law says that the underlying soils, if they're agricultural land, maintain that classification in the future once the site is decommissioned. So it's kind of a unique status in the law. I talked about Act 250, kind of permanent impacts to soils that can take place that we mitigate under Section 248. We have kind of a robust set of recommended permit conditions to make sure that you put it back how you found it. At least we hope you will. We recognize there are uncertainties in the future when soils could be compacted or things like that. But we really try with permit conditions to make sure there's bulk density testing, pre and post disturbance, that essentially that's put back how you found it is the goal. We also recognize the importance of renewable energy in Vermont. And so I mentioned reclamation. So most of these projects are at least one day required to be reclaimed and put back to being ag soils once the solar project is decommissioned, which again is I recognize is mostly kind of in the future. So there's some uncertainties as to how that will play out, but it should be put back to agriculture. And that's kind of what the law says as far as the underlying agricultural soils, once they're decommissioned, are still PAS land. However, there also are some impacts that are simply permanent, like substations. You're putting down a concrete foundation that can't really be easily reclaimed. So the agency has been also using the offsite mitigation fees to Vermont Housing and Conservation Board mechanism as well in the Section 248 context for those more permanent type impacts like a substation. So there are recent examples of Section 248 solar projects that have paid fees to VHCB to conserve farmland in the region as well. So it's kind of there are some similarities, there are some differences, and it's all very complex because like I was saying on the Act 250 side, it's kind of a balancing act of the importance of our finite amount of farmland. They're not making any more of it, right? We only have so much. We're losing soils every year. Mitigation helps with that by setting aside land either on-site or off-site. At the same time, it's also really important to have housing and economic development. So it's a balancing act. And in the Section 248 world, there's also a balancing act of we value renewable energy. We also value the underlying farmland. We also recognize, the property rights of landowners. There's a lot of considerations. So it gets pretty complicated. And I really appreciate everyone's interest in this topic and kind of concern for the agricultural land.
So there is no, I want to just expand beyond solar to power generation, but for solar, there's no soil mitigation requirement. There's no fee or set aside.
Except for the permanent impact. So the solar panels themselves, usually that underlying area, once it's decommissioned, there should be permit conditions requiring it to be reclaimed back to PAS. But there are, like I was saying, even associated with solar projects, there could be a part of that project where there's really just a permanent impact taking place. And in some cases there have been offset mitigation fees paid even in that context.
What about something like Rygate, where power generation probably falls under the 248 rather than Act 250?
I'm not positive off the top of my head. I have to get back to you on that. Good question, though.
It's a PUC.
You see.
Yeah, but may have different.
Probably on prime ag soils though,
Yeah.
it's like in the floodplain.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Two things. One, yesterday, the gentleman in here for solar told us there were 986,000 acres of prime ag soil in the state of Vermont.
Mhm.
I tend not to believe that. Did you have a number?
I could get you a number. I don't have it off the top of my head. I guess the question would be, so there's the broader category of primary agricultural soils, which includes prime, statewide, and local. So I don't have the number, but whatever the number is, it'd be helpful to know what it is for primary, and then also just for prime, which is the most finite of all, statewide and local. And then the other consideration is are there existing impacts or not? So are we talking at the mapping of the soils?
And that's on it all.
Or yeah, does it consider like if there already are structures?
And the second thing is, I've always proposed to the land trust, VHCB, I think I did it right in here. Why, if a solar site's going in, it's gonna tie up the land from agriculture for 25, 30 years.
Right.
Why isn't there a mitigation value put on that? And then VHCB or the land trust could short-term buy the development rights on the edge of a community and hold it for 20, 25 years to see, then if the community wants to grow at that point, this land gets taken out of solar, put back in ag land, and this land gets released for future development.
Like a lease mitigation.
Exactly.
The map that you had up a little bit earlier on one of the slides, it was slide 11, Ari, and not that you remember, but it showed a statewide map showing Act 250 primary ag soils.
Right.
And it's got, it looks like it could be like a sixth of the state, just looking at this map. It's hard to tell, obviously, but
Right.
runs down the lake, and then the spine of the Green Mountains is white, so not there. Derby looks kind of green, maybe.
Derby ought to be green, green.
Yeah. But yeah, if you can give us those numbers, like
Absolutely, yeah.
how many acres are there primary and how many within, breaking it down even further, that would be interesting.
Yeah, I'd be happy
How
to.
much is developed? Do you have that too?
That's complicated because, we get an estimate, but it's a little bit site specific. Like if we review a project, the impacts could also include indirect impacts. So like fragmentation. So some of these spots where you see, there might be a area like this and not all the soils are physically impacted, but they're all kind of cut up. And so it requires a little bit of analysis as to, are they already indirectly impacted? Are they fragmented? We could certainly get an estimate, but as far as like the specific number of developed acres, it would somewhat depend on your methodology as to, are you looking at just like physical impacts on the soils? Are you also considering the indirect impacts or fragmentation to those soils? But yeah, I'd be more than happy to look at the NRCS data and try to run those numbers and get you the best estimate we can on those figures.
That would be helpful. Yeah. John.
Just curious, when a solar field, we've heard a lot about taking a solar field out.
Yeah.
What's actually involved? When they put in those panels, are they mounted in concrete or they just post in the ground? And presumably they're all connected with wires and
Yeah.
I mean, what's involved?
Yeah, so there often are pads, kind of concrete pads below them. I'm not the best expert on the technical aspects of solar. We have a team and some others who know those technical nuances a little better. But it's a question I'm happy to get back to you on. But I know that they're required to be decommissioned ultimately, and there's permit conditions that kind of try to ensure that's done in the most soil friendly way possible. Yeah.
Is there any talk within the agency of ag and looking more, you spoke to the fragmentation?
Yeah.
If there's the impact of like where the physical building goes, but there's the greater impact that surrounds it where this land isn't being farmed anymore, even though it's open.
Right.
Probably whether it's rock hog or mowed lawn at this point. Is there any conversation with the agency of ag at analyzing that impact, not just the land base underneath the footprint of the building?
Right. No, great question. So every time we review a project, we do consider the indirect impacts as well as the direct impacts. So the way we look at indirect impacts is fragmentation that's proposed into less than 100-foot resulting width, or kind of less than one isolated acre. So if you're going to be, creating lots of 50-foot strips of grass, that's still considered an impact if you're putting driveways on either side of those 50-foot strips or buildings. So yeah, our reviews and the calculation of impacts, which relates to the calculation of mitigation acreage, does encompass the indirect fragmentation type impacts. So you might be only impacting 1 acre as far as like physical construction, but it might be 2 acres when you consider the indirect impacts as well. The other consideration is access. So are you isolating land that's not going to be available in the future? And typically we say if it's less than 1 isolated acre, that's also considered an indirect impact. There are other impacts that are not captured if it's just, kind of more just over time that the land gets less desirable for farming, or there's so many things that can whittle away at farmland. But the way I explained it, as far as the fragmentation to less than 100-foot width or less than one isolated acre, is kind of what would actually get captured as a 9B impact and reviewing for mitigation.
If we translate that over to, does any of that translate over to solar arrays too? Because I feel like, it's kind of the same ballpark where you have this land that technically could be farmed in some way, shape or form, probably mostly by hand because it's not big enough for Richard's combine.
Right.
Chopper to get in there, but, is there anything that the agency does to look at solar arrays in the same light?
So the framework for solar, like I was saying, is more about reclamation and then mitigating the permanent impacts. But certainly, the permit conditions we recommend would try to make sure that when all is said and done, that land is not unduly chopped up and so it's kind of we do our best, but it is hard to count for the full amount of fragmentation that can take place, but we kind of do our best within the framework we have of Section 248 to make sure it's reclaimed. Yeah. So, but the mitigation aspect of indirect impacts under criterion 9B is quite robust and a standard part of every review, as far as if you're leaving, it happens all the time. You're leaving 90-foot strip on the side, or you're leaving a quarter acre here, a quarter acre there. We do make sure that that's mitigated either on site or off for jurisdictional projects. Good question.
I mean, it's those fragmented spaces around developments are very similar to, even though there's soil there, but it can't be really utilized, right?
Well,
And whether
yeah,
or not it's,
but be careful
once you
because
have
not,
solar panels, it might be beautiful, it might be prime ag soil, it might be class 1. But if it's sitting there for 25 years underneath solar panels,
oh, I understand.
Vermonters
I'm
can't
just
use
saying, when you talk about the fragmented pieces, remember, a 2-acre piece is a pain, pounded thumb for me.
yeah,
But for somebody that wants to have a beautiful garden site, and grow food, they can create income off 2 acres of really good soil.
It's interesting.
I
It's
think
still
it's even harder to do under solar, so.
under solar panels are just, desert. Unless John gets paid to graze his sheep in here, so they don't have to bush hog it.
Effectively type 13. Soil, I think.
Yeah.
It's interesting you say Representative, it's interesting you say 2 acres, because actually I didn't mention this, but when we review on-site mitigation land, the minimum area for on-site mitigation is 2 acres, because it's kind of the minimum to be capable of supporting an economic or commercial agriculture operation. So that's what we require for on-site mitigation, at least 2 contiguous acres. At the same time, there also are examples of, even half an acre or a quarter acre or an urban garden that can still have great food. So I recognize some people can be really amazing in how much food they can produce. Like my dad in Western Massachusetts, he grows a ton of food on like 1/10 of an acre, and solar cones and season extensions. So there's always people who can produce food on very small amounts of land, which is inspiring. But as far as like the on-site mitigation, it's a 2 acre minimum. Yeah.
We're running way over, and I will, before we give Representative O'Brien the last question, I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Really helpful, interesting presentation.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I feel like I learned a lot, and hopefully we all did, and we'll continue talking about it. But
Yeah,
John, you get the
just
last
one
word.
last follow-up. Is there, I know in Tunbridge, there was a cell phone tower proposed.
Okay.
And well, we couldn't say ban the construction of it, because that's in the PUC's jurisdiction. We could ask for bonding for decommissioning.
Okay.
So I wonder what happens with solar on ag land? Can the town or the agency or VHCB or somebody ask essentially for bonding for decommissioning? So that, because I can just see in 25 years, you'll have like dead malls, they'll just be solar fields that, for economic reasons may never be either decommissioned or re-upped as, whatever the new modern technology is.
I'm not sure Garfield would be driving by it down there saying, why did we let that go in?
Yeah, Anyone know the answer to that is about bonding? I'm actually not sure off the top of my head. I know in the agency's reviews, we review either the reclamation side or an offsite mitigation fee to VHCB. We don't request bonds that I'm aware of ourselves. Is there a different entity that does? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's a valid question. Yeah,
All right, great, thank you.
thank you so much. Really appreciate your time and interest.
Take a little break here. Apologies to our next group, but let's take a short break.